Welcome back to my channel. I used to post videos on here when I was part of my last company, Enthusiast Gaming, and then when I left, and then starting a venture capital fund. But I've really gone kind of silent for the past year, flying under the radar a little bit, working in stealth mode. And I want to give anyone who's been following along in the past, or anyone who's just joining in now, just kind of an update. I really introduce you to my new company, Glimmer, which is my main focus right now. The focus, what I'd like to be focused on for the next 10, 20 years. The mission is really, really important for me. It's a mental health focused company. But I also want to get a little bit into kind of how I got into it, how it came about that I moved on from Enthusiast, my old company, which was in the video game sector, so it wasn't even in the mental health world. It's been quite a journey. So just to get started, when I was young, I realized that I could really only work in something that I was incredibly, incredibly passionate about. So I don't know what it is. It's just whether that's a weakness or a strength. That's just something that working 9 to 5 every day and something that bores me, or is like, maybe build some skills, but it's not something that I'm personally passionate about, was just not something that I could entertain. When I was 18 or so, I discussed with like a mentor slash guidance counselor, what is it that I'm passionate about, and what is it that I think in the future I'd want to get into. And there was really two things that interested me. One was video game. As a kid, as a teenager, as a young adult, I was very, very into video games, and I wanted to know everything about it. I would write about it. I would research it, and obviously I played a lot of video games. So I thought maybe become a video game developer. The other thing I thought of was I loved psychology. I always felt psychologically inclined. As a teenager, I would just read textbooks about like Freudian analysis, the evolution of psychotherapy over the years. I did that just as a hobby, and so those were the two things. I thought I would be either a video game developer or a therapist. Funny enough, I realized as I got older that I was actually good at business and building organizations, creating a large-scale organization. So instead of becoming a video game developer, I ran a video game company. And now, rather than being a therapist, I'm running a mental health company. That's the way I think that can make the most impact at scale. And I love my artistry rather than painting or music or things like that. The creation of a new innovative type of a product that is affected by creating large-scale organizations, and being able to do it at mass. Initially, when I started out in business, I started the video game route. That was something that was very passionate about. At that time, I think I was more passionate about video games than I was about psychology and the mental health world. Even though I was continued reading up on it and following up on that industry, I loved video games, and I put 10 years into that. That was my company, founded it in my father's basement, which eventually grew to to a NASDAQ company with 400 or so employees and $200 million or so of revenue. I learned a lot along the way. I read Ben Horowitz's book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things. It's like, there's no school for being a CEO, for sure not the CEO of a public company. So your first time, you're learning a lot. There's so many different things you have to know in terms of investors, investment banks, hitting different ceilings of scale and needing to break through those ceilings and create new organizational hierarchy, M&A, PR, HR, building a sales team. It was a very, very exciting journey, and I learned a ton from that. And of course, I also made mistakes along the way as I was learning on the fly. I surrounded myself with a lot of advisors and mentors who would help me identify those mistakes. But what really got me out of the gaming industry was in 2020. This isn't something I've shared publicly until now, although my friends and community and employees all knew it. I got the UK variant of COVID, and for the first 10 days or so, it was just like a really bad flu, like a really bad flu. But still, at the end of the day, it wasn't, it was just a flu. But on the 10th day, my lungs got pneumonia, got COVID pneumonia, and my lungs start to fill with fluid. At the time, I remember having read in articles like, if you go early, you'll prevent any kind of issues. So I went to the emergency room. They were inundated with people at the time. This was March 2020, and they sent me home. And they said it's not bad enough. Just continue, whatever, just resting and come back if it gets worse. I came back the next day. It did get worse. They didn't even have a doctor on hand to see me, just a nurse practitioner. And I said, I think I need oxygen. I can't really breathe. They took imaging and whatnot. And they sent me home. The next morning, I actually couldn't breathe. The X-rays showed my entire lungs were just complete white, meaning entirely fluid. There was no more room left to breathe. I went into the ER, and that was the toughest day of my entire life. That was tremendous suffering because it just felt like I was drowning for like 10 hours straight. and then they would lower it, see if I would start suffering, and then they would a new nurse would come in. It was like being waterboarded. Really the worst time of my entire life. My lungs were getting worse, and they realized that things were getting pretty bad. So they admitted me into the hospital, and they said it was touch and go. There was a 50-50% chance of me living. Um, they put me onto a breathing apparatus to continue breathing, and I was semi conscious for several days, and then spent several weeks in the hospital where I wasn't allowed any visitors. Everyone was in quarantine. So basically, sat and contemplated like, am I going to get better? Is this going to get better or is this going to get worse? The doctor said it could go either way. That period of reflection within like a near death experience, I guess I did a lot of like bargaining with God about if I get better, if you give me another chance at this, then I'll work on something that I feel really impacts life. As much as I loved video games, um, I didn't necessarily feel like I was making the world a better place. A lot of people got a lot of joy from video games. I would see like at our events that there was a lot of electricity, there was a lot of social connection. So there were definitely good aspects of it. But then I would also see a certain subset of our customers who were kind of escaping from life with it and were actually suffering from a lot of mental health issues, depression, anxiety, and whatnot. They were escaping into video games, but not really finding a solution. Um, and even some of our own staff. We had an early on staff member in the company. His name is John Kim, and he looked like the most happy-go-lucky person. And then one day he committed suicide, and we held a memorial for him. But it was interesting that you couldn't tell that he was going through a hard time. Um, I also had a high school friend who was also like an incredibly fun, humorous person, always smiling, someone everyone loved to be around. And then he committed suicide, and everyone discussed like, why didn't we have the resources to kind of prevent this or to even know that these people were going through difficult times? So in my mind at that point, I think that planted the first seed is that once I did heal and I did get out of the hospital and I did make a full recovery, and over time my lungs completely healed. Um, but it just had I was different after that. I decided that, um, first of all, at Enthusiast, the environment at the time was not something that I wanted to be a part of anymore. It just didn't. Um, it's much from what I hear right now. It's great. It's much better right now. But at the time, the environment wasn't a happy place to be working in, um, and I didn't have the control or influence to be able to create the environment that I think staff would appreciate. Um, so I didn't really want to put up with that anymore. And also, I personally didn't feel inspired by the mission anymore. And like I said at the beginning, I have a hard time working in things that I'm not passionate about. I have to be very passionate about that. And my own family grew. I had 4 kids. I wasn't the same as when I was in my 20s to then my mid 30s. Um, so I felt like if I got out of here and I recovered, I would want to work on um, something that helps the human cause, and that I feel inspired and passionate about again. So, you know, 6 to 12 months later, I don't remember the exact timeline of what month that was, but I started to move on. Um, I finally took a break from Enthusiast, which was a major roller coaster for 10 years. I never was able to take a vacation. I would go to the beach in Miami and I would just be still thinking about the company. And when you have a stock ticker, then it's even harder, right? Because you have to mentally teach yourself to not look at the stock. So I got my first break, and that was amazing. Um, and at that time, I started to research way more heavily the mental health industry because that's really where I thought I want to spend the rest of my life focusing on. If I can make a difference there, then we can impact so much of humanity, so much of society who suffers. Um, like I think wars and hate and are all coming from mental health issues. And then of course on the micro level, people's families, um, the suicide rates, the addiction rates, the general family breakdowns. A lot of this comes just through mental health issues, right? Where there's a lot of intergenerational trauma, years of wars and whatnot. So, right, I started doing major research into every aspect of mental health. And when I go into things, I really go into things intensely in terms of knowing it as broadly and as deeply as possible. So I looked at 4 different major aspects of mental health. the psychological, the pharmacological, the neurobiological, and the lifestyle aspects. A lot of words. I'm not going to go too much into that. I don't want to bore anyone who's not specifically interested on these particulars. But just as an example, within the psychological realm, looking at how therapy has evolved over the years, there's the therapies focusing on the prefrontal cortex, the front of the brain, whether it's CBT, DBT, ACT, narrative, motivational interviewing, etc. All those types of therapy. The back of the brain, the limbic system ones. So ego state therapy, IFS, EMDR, trauma-informed therapy, attachment disorders, somatic, sensory motor work, all of those types, and understanding what makes a good therapist, what makes a bad therapist, what type of eclectic toolbox does the therapist have to have in order to really be effective. Speaking to a lot of experts and advisors, which was one of the things at Enthusiast. We always got incredible advisors, people who are high up there at Nintendo and Xbox and Twitch and PlayStation. So I was taking the same approach over here of like going to the very top of the field, and picking their brains about it and understanding it. So that's the psychological. Then there's the pharmacological, which is how medicine and psychiatrists impact treatment. So SSRIs, SNRIs, MAOIs, sleep medicine, psychedelics. And within psychedelics also, there's a massive breakdown of different psychedelics affect different parts of the brain, rewire the neuroplasticity in different types of the brain, whether it's psilocybin, ayahuasca, ibogaine, LSD, MDMA, and then looking at all the research and reports on them. Neurobiological part of all this, a lot of new developments and treatments have come out purely neurobiologically, whether it is TMS, electrocranial stimulation, polyvagal theory, neurofeedback. There's the lifestyle components, looking at diet, exercise, sleep, having a social network and a support system, family, relationships. How do all these things affect someone's mental health? And then looking at how do we, what's deficient overall in the way that all these different siloed, the hundreds of different types of treatments, all working in silos where people becoming experts in specific modalities, but most people only having touched on one or two of these independently. So essentially after all the research I was doing, what I discovered was that it turns out that people suffering through mental health issues, if you're an outpatient, meaning you're just the regular person who's not in a facility, you're just going about your daily life, your work, your home life, and you're trying to get help on a mental health challenge, there's only a 13% rate of success right now with psychology and psychiatry. Extremely low. And that doesn't mean that when you find a therapist that really works for you, you get the help that you need, you don't start recovering. But initially, when you start off, without experimenting and trialing and really being motivated to try different treatments, there's only 13% success rate. And to me, a very big part of that is everything stems from the fact that it's self-navigated. That's my terminology, is like people are self-managing or self-navigating in their mental health journey. And the issues that come out of self-navigating are that, if someone is, let's say, in a university, they're in a dorm room and they find themselves cutting themselves. Suddenly they're faced with a major mental health crisis and they're embarrassed. There's a stigma. It's taboo. It's something that people don't feel so accepted talking about. So then they're Googling a therapist or Googling the issue, not really knowing what the diagnosis is or how to assess themselves. Finding a therapist online, or maybe their roommate is telling them a therapist. The problem is that there's a lot of issues with self-navigation. So just starting off with therapists. Typically, people who are therapists are wounded healers. They're someone who has already been through their own pain and their own mental health journey. And usually when they come out the other end and they've been healed, they now want to help others. So that's a good therapist, someone who came out through their own issues, is healthy now, and is able to then pass it on and help others. The problem is that with wounded healers, there are, I would say 30 to 40% of therapists are healers who are still wounded. They haven't gotten to a healthy place. And rather than trying to help you, they're really trying to help themselves. Through helping you, they vicariously, either they're codependent or they're in control, whatever the issues are. If you're not healthy, you can't pass on health to someone else as a therapist. And unfortunately, 30 to 40% of therapists are like that. So for all the brilliant therapists out there, there are also very, very harmful ones. And you, as the client, if you are a client, um, you're the person's going through crisis. How are they supposed to be the expert on who out there is healthy and is good for them and knows what they're doing? It's kind of like if you're building a house. I usually use this analogy of like you hire a contractor. You're not figuring out who the right painter is, the architect, the carpenter. You're not doing all that. You go to a general contractor who knows his whole job is being an expert in how to build a house. So when someone's facing a crisis, a mental health crisis, suddenly they're expected to kind of know everything about a very complex issue and be the expert on that. That's very, very difficult. That's next to impossible. So a lot of it is luck that they get the right therapist. But there's a very strong chance that they might end up with a harmful therapist. That's 30 to 40%. Another 40%, I would say, are the ones that I call average to slightly above neutral. So they're not great therapists. They're okay, but someone might be sitting for 2 years in therapy with them, paying a lot of money, and questioning like, have I progressed over here? How far have I progressed? They might get to a point where they say, oh, therapy just doesn't work. I spent so much money and time on it and I haven't really gotten anywhere, and they drop out of therapy. They don't know exactly what's wrong. So that's another 40%. And then I would say like 20 to 30% are actually very competent, good at their jobs. But even there are issues because you have to be matched to the right therapist. Not, for example, let's say someone has borderline personality. Initially, they might need DBT to help them work on stabilizing emotions and dealing with out of control emotions. After that, they might switch to more of a focus on trauma work and unpacking a lot of the underlying foundational issues that cause it in the first place. How's someone supposed to know that those are the type of modalities that they need, and also be matched with the right type of person that fits to them? And then how are they supposed to know, like, if you have a blood pressure issue, there's a number that tells you that everyone's on the same page. Is this an issue or is it not an issue? It's very defined. In therapy right now, there's not a big focus on measurement-based care. So you could be sitting in therapy and not really knowing, okay, I've come a long way in this, now it's time to switch to this. I need to tweak that. So even with good therapists, you need to be matched. There needs to be a plan that makes sense to the right modality. And then even in the top 10% elite therapists, there's an issue of, I've seen a lot of elite therapists who are taking on 40 to 50 clients a week. And that's practically unethical because rather than being a person, you're basically a number to them. They have to check their notes to remind themselves who you are again each week because there are too many clients. And the whole goal of therapy is it's got to be based on a therapeutic alliance, the underlying safe and healthy attachment, the connection between the client and the therapist. So if someone isn't getting a therapist who's able to devote the right amount of time and mental energy to them, that's also an issue. Unfortunately, therapists right now have supervisors that they are able to go to when they have a question. So if they're driven and they're motivated, they will be asking questions. But there's no one really representing the client themselves to make sure that everything is accountable and kind of looking at the bigger picture of it. So those are the issues with therapists. With psychiatrists, the issue is there's a lot of misdiagnosis based on the fact that the psychiatrist is typically not in touch with the therapist. There's no one connecting the dots. So when you're able to get into them, very often after 30, 45 minutes of talking to you, they already have the assessment. They already have an entire plan for you. Whereas the therapist might have been talking to the person for several years and will be continuing to talk to them and able to modify things. So there's no connecting the dots, which often leads to a lot of psychiatric misdiagnosis. An additional issue in the entire industry is that there are so many different types of treatment. Like I mentioned, there's neurobiological, lifestyle, psychological, and pharmacological. All those different pieces, people are not typically integrating a multidisciplinary approach into the treatment. So people are getting very siloed treatment. They're just getting a therapist, or they're just getting meds prescribed, and pretty much that's it. Whereas there's so much more out there nowadays that can be integrated. So there isn't really a multidisciplinary approach. All these things essentially are what I consider to be products of the self-navigation route, the paradigm of self-navigating and self-managing your own mental health journey. And that's why I think that there's only 13% success rate. Now, I did find that there's another paradigm, a completely different paradigm, where there's a 68% success rate. And that is inpatient, the inpatient paradigm. The paradigm over there is if someone has an issue, the severity of their symptoms are so strong in intensity and frequency that they're no longer able to function, then everyone realizes, oh, they can't self-navigate this. They can't self-manage the mental health journey. They're not functioning. They have to go inpatient. So, for example, with suicidal ideation, they might end up in a psychiatric ward. If they are, if they have eating disorder, they might end up in an eating disorder clinic if it gets bad enough. With addiction, if that gets bad enough, then they end up in a rehab facility. In all of these places, there's a whole different paradigm. The person comes in, they're self-managed they're co-managed from the beginning. So they'll come in, they'll get diagnosed, they'll get triaged with assessments, they will be assigned a therapist, they will be the therapist is typically of a very high quality, so there's a quality assurance with the therapist because you're paying a lot of money to get into an inpatient facility. So those positions of being a therapist at a facility is looked up to as like a cushy job. So they'll get a higher quality just by virtue of being an inpatient facility. Then they'll be assigned to group therapy or 12-step groups, so they're getting the social aspect. They'll have psychiatric consult that's plugging in with the psychiatry piece as part of the entire holistic treatment plan. Very often rehab centers have a brain area that's focused purely on neurobiological treatments. So the CS alpha stim devices and neurofeedback, and there's lifestyle components. They're looking at diet, exercise, etc. And then once a week, they'll typically, all the different stakeholders get together and they discuss for 20 minutes each client so that they're connecting all the dots. There's a certain amount of accountability. So there's a 68% improvement rate. And I believe because the paradigm is different. It's multidisciplinary, it's holistic with the connecting of the dots, it's a whole circle of care with the quality assurance. So the entire model is different. The major issue though with inpatient is that number one, it's very expensive because you're dealing with a brick and mortar facility. You have to have someone who's in a bed, who's assigned a bed, has food. They have full-time staff because the person's spending full-time there for whatever, a month or so. Or if it's a psych ward for suicide prevention, it could be 3 days. But because it's so expensive, the goal is really acute care. How do we get them out of dysfunction into functioning again? It's not ongoing care. It's not the maintenance. So there's a huge cost to it. It's very expensive to go. It's only for acute care. It's only for a short amount of time. So it's not really a model. It's a model for the 1%. It's a model that's only accessible to people who have the highest level of dysfunction who need to go in person. But the other 99% of people, the moment, or even the inpatients, once they are out, back into their life again, so they suddenly go completely back into self-management, self-navigating, where they're expected to be able to continue and improve without a multidisciplinary team of care. So to me, that became the obvious answer that if we want to increase success rates, have a better quality assurance, have better management, we need to move to a different paradigm. We need to be moving to a co-managed approach. That should be the new paradigm for mental health. And I looked around the industry at 400 mental health companies. I found one who was doing it just specifically almost like a concierge for eating disorders, but no one was really doing it at scale for just general outpatients. No one was using this co-managed multidisciplinary circle of care. What I loved was the fact that during COVID, we saw a lot of things move more to virtual. Everything became more accessible, and it was okay to use telehealth. So for me, the goal when I started Glimmer about a year ago, the goal was really to take the best of the inpatient model, the co-managed approach, the multidisciplinary holistic circle of care, and abstract out the pieces that can be turned virtual so that we don't carry that kind of an overhead. You're not spending 30 to 80 grand a month, but you're able to get the best of that. And people could be co-managed in their mental health. They could be living their regular life, going to work, struggling with something. They plug into Glimmer as their first line of defense, and they're assigned a case manager who then builds them an entire treatment plan that's customized to them. It's measured with data and analytics to see, so it's measurement-based care. They're able to see on a graph as they're getting better. We're able to see kind of what's working, what's not working. There are many different types of interventions across. We're looking at everything in terms of their diet, their exercise, their lifestyle, their social, of course, the psychological, the pharmacological, the neurobiological. All of that is taken into account for a circle of care. And my goal is that can we bump up from that low percent of success for typical outpatient? Can we bump that up by 20, 30% success rate? Because if you do that, you could be saving 20, 30 million lives um, just in a country like the United States. If you go global, obviously it'd be much larger. Uh, so really, that's my goal, is to use technology and to use data. A lot of people ask me right now, are you guys a service business like a clinic, or are you a technology platform? Like a, so to me, it's we're not in one or the other. It's more like the way Uber was not a taxi company, but it's also not a pure technology company. It's a mixture of a service that becomes way more efficient by putting it into a new framework and a new paradigm using technology. So for me, it's using data and using analytics and technology and telehealth to be able to create an entirely different framework in the mental health world that you're able to kind of check in with an app every day, and we're able to see kind of where your mood is. But then there's the best of people and there's the best of technology coming together to create an entirely new platform. So essentially, we're a mental health platform that's the mixture of people, technology, and processes. Um, so this work is really inspiring to me. Like I'm very excited about it. Um, I invested the initial close to $1 million for the past year. I want to really before I went out. Initially, I had a lot of commitments from investors as soon as I left Enthusiast to put in whatever I was putting in doing next. I just didn't feel comfortable with that. I felt more comfortable putting some meat on the bone, proving out a little bit of the idea, getting a pilot launched in Ontario, which is what we did the past year. Was really started clinically in October, uh, driving up revenue, building out the team clinically. Um, we have a fantastic leadership team already. We scaled up the staff, the clinical staff, and then in the past month or so, I raised another bunch of money, which was our first outside round from friends and family, and with the goal of now launching in the United States. So we just got licensed in one state, and we're going to be trying to go across all 50 states, and or as many as we can. And then yeah, I think it's similar to Enthusiast in a certain way, in that Enthusiast had two businesses really. First was the scale business. In order to scale, we need to get to like 300 million gamers. So for the first 5 years of Enthusiast, I really built like an engine, which was the ad network. The ad network was really just like you could buy an asset and plug it in, and we will monetize it. Whether the sales team, the ad technology, the ad exchange, the programmatic ads, all of that was in order to feed the asset to scale. We had to have a back engine. So we built that back engine. Then we were able to initially we started just representing websites, and eventually started acquiring, then acquiring talent and esports influencers, YouTube events, etc. We built this massive scale, and then on top of that, once we were at scale, we had the critical mass. The things you're able to do with critical mass are much more credible, because once we got to that point, then any Fortune 500 company could come to us, and we could create a full 360 campaign for them of how to reach gamers that no one else could create. So it allowed something entirely new. Obviously, that this is an old tactic. Amazon did that too. They started off with books, but as they scaled, then they were able to take that whole e-commerce platform and become the e-commerce platform for everything, and change the overall way that commerce was done. So for me, I look at it with Glimmer. In the new platform, there's an underlying piece to it, which is just scaling out a higher quality therapeutic clinical services. So therapists who are all kind of in that upper echelon of quality, with some basic case management, matchmaking to the right type of therapist, and then having the measurement, the data as the client checks in, we're able to kind of follow along the graph and see if there's any interventions. Then there's a second layer, which is the whole multidisciplinary team. And the multidisciplinary team, that's once we're at scale, we're able to do a lot more there in terms of really providing a lot of these additional disciplines in there. So my first goal is to kind of scaling as widely as possible. And then while we're doing that, we're in the R&D part of tier 2. We call it tier 1, tier 2. Tier 1 is less of an intervention is needed, and tier 2 is more multidisciplinary and holistic. So I have my work cut out for me. It's very exciting times for me. Like, we have such a phenomenal team. I think one of the things I learned about from my Enthusiast days were, we had 400 staff. I saw the hiring of many different C-suite leadership, board, the types of investors. And right now, because of everything I saw before, I'm very, very selective and picky about who we let into the company. So right now, like the level of quality and excellence of the staff, the investor base, like the investor base is unbelievable. Like in terms of the quality of the investor base right now, um, there's no hedge funds or people want to quick out pump and dumpers. That was one of the big learnings from Enthusiast was learning which investors you want to allow in. I came in very naive at the beginning. If someone was willing to hand me $1 million check, sure, I'll take it without really understanding who they really were. Um, I'm much more selective right now, so the staff is really like an A+ team. The mission of what we're doing is something that's I feel extremely motivated every day to just jump out of bed and get to work on solving issues, major issues for humanity. And then our investors, who've with the round we just raised, feel very blessed with um, the team that we have and the group that we got. So I will try to continue to keep everyone now that the cat's out of the bag, and I was able to finally let everyone in on what we've been doing, kind of in stealth mode the past year. Um, I'll try and continue to hopefully in a shorter video than my launch video. Um, Keep everyone updated, and I hope everyone comes along for the ride. And um, as we grow, love to have more people invest or just be an ambassador of the company. Um, yeah, we'll just whoever wants to join along. We had that with Enthusiasts. It was very exciting. Social media, etc. We had a lot of people just cheerleading along the way, and that was always fun. So whoever wants to be a part of that journey, I will try to keep everyone appraised of what's going on, and hopefully we could do a lot of good together. So thanks for listening.